On the night of November the 2nd, 1907, J.P. Morgan locked the presidents of New York's trust companies inside his private library and put the key in his coat pocket. The men shut inside managed hundreds of millions of dollars of other people's savings, and Morgan wanted their signatures on one piece of paper before dawn. That autumn, the United States had no central bank. It had him, a 70-year-old private banker with a stubborn head cold, deciding which institutions would live and which would be let go. For 3 weeks, the country's lender of last resort was one man with a cigar. It sounds like something a screenwriter invented. It is in the memoirs of the men who stood in that room, and the signatures came at 4:45 in the morning. This episode walks the 3 weeks that put him there. It starts with two brothers trying to corner a copper stock, and it ends with the Federal Reserve. In between, there is a run that pulled $8 million out of one marble lobby before lunch. There is a loan rate that touched 100%, and there is a purchase made at the very bottom of the panic that Morgan's admirers have spent a century explaining. Every crash was somebody's payday. This one kept the receipt. New York, the first week of October 1907. The money of the city was arranged in 2 tiers, and only one of them had a safety net. The first tier was the national banks. They lived under federal rules and kept roughly a quarter of their deposits in ready cash. They belonged to the New York Clearing House, the private association where member banks met every morning to settle each other's checks. The club had teeth. Members inspected one another. When one of them wobbled, the rest could carry it, because a member falling looked bad for everybody. It was not a central bank. On a quiet day, you could squint and mistake it for one. The second tier was the trust companies, and they are the mechanism of everything that follows. A trust company was chartered to mind estates, widows' money, the paperwork of the dead. Then somebody noticed what else the charter allowed. It could take deposits like a bank. It could pay interest like a bank and lend like a bank, without the rules that came with being one. Where a national bank in New York held about 25 cents of ready money against every dollar of deposits, a trust company held about 5. The bankers all knew this arithmetic. The depositors had never been shown it. Trusts could lend against stock certificates. They could finance speculators overnight. They could grow at a speed the banks could only watch. In the 10 years before 1907, the trusts of New York had swollen until they held nearly as much money as the banks themselves, and they sat outside the clearinghouse. No morning settlement, no inspections, nobody obliged to catch them. Hold on to that 5%. It is the whole story. The money behind all of this was already tight, and the reason was a fire 3,000 miles away. In April 1906, San Francisco burned after the earthquake, and a startling share of the insurance was payable from London. So London insurance men spent a year shipping gold across the Atlantic to pay for a city that had burned on another ocean, and the Bank of England, watching its vaults drain, raised rates and leaned on the insurers to slow down. Money got dearer everywhere. In March 1907, the New York market had already buckled once, a slide the papers called a rich men's panic, and the city of New York itself was struggling to sell its own bonds by summer. None of that causes a panic on its own. It just means the room was full of gas before anyone struck a match. The showpiece of the trust tier was the Knickerbocker, third largest trust company in the city. $65 million of deposits, belonging to 18,000 depositors. Its headquarters stood on Fifth Avenue, built like a Roman temple, marble columns and bronze doors, directly across from the old Waldorf Astoria. Its president was Charles T. Barney, a clubman and real estate operator who had ridden the trust structure to a fortune and a house on Park Avenue. Depositors did not read charters, they read marble. Monday, October the 14th. The corner itself is almost a comedy. What it touched was not. Augustus Heinzer was a copper man from Butte, Montana. He had spent a decade tormenting the Standard Oil crowd in the Montana courts. with judges friendly enough that his rivals finally paid him north of $10 million just to go away. He took the money to New York and bought his way into banking. He found a partner in Charles W. Morse, a main operator who already controlled a chain of banks. Morse had once cornered the ice supply of New York itself and doubled the price of ice in the tenements in a hot summer. These were two of the most combustible reputations in the city. They now sat on the boards of banks holding ordinary depositors' money. The younger brother, Otto, believed he had found a sure thing. United Copper, the family company, was being sold short. Otto convinced himself the short sellers had borrowed the family's own shares to do it. Corner the stock, call the borrowed shares home, and the shorts would have to buy their way out at any price the Heinzes cared to name. On Monday morning, his brokers began buying on the curb market. The curb in 1907 meant exactly what it sounds like: a crowd of brokers shouting at each other on the pavement of Broad Street, in the open air, in whatever the weather was doing. United Copper went from $39 to $60 in a single day. On Tuesday, Otto called the borrowed shares home. They came. They kept coming. The shorts had not borrowed from the Heinzes after all. There were far more shares loose in the street than Otto's arithmetic allowed. Once the buying stopped, the price went looking for a floor that was not there. $10 by Wednesday. On Thursday morning, the exchange suspended Otto's brokerage house, and the firm that had done his buying failed alongside it. A failed corner normally ruins one family and entertains everybody else. This one did not stop there. Augustus Heinze was also the president of a national bank, the Mercantile National, and by Thursday, its depositors had read the newspapers and formed a line. Here is the detail that mattered, and almost nobody weighed it at the time. The Mercantile was a clearinghouse bank. The club sent in its examiners, found the bank solvent, and stood behind it on one condition: Heinze, Morse, and every director connected to them were to be out of banking by the weekend. They went. On Sunday night, the men of the clearinghouse went to bed, believing the fire was out. They had defended the banks. The fire was not in the banks. Charles Barney of the Knickerbocker was a friend and backer of Morse, not of the corner. Nobody has ever traced $1 of Knickerbocker money into the copper scheme. It did not matter. The weekend purge had sent every bank in the city back to its own ledgers, rereading its exposures to anyone in the Morse orbit. The National Bank of Commerce found that it was guaranteeing, with its own money, the daily checks of a trust run by a Morse ally, and it decided to stop. On Monday, October the 21st, it announced that it would no longer clear for the Knickerbocker Trust. One sentence of banking plumbing, published in the evening papers. What 18,000 depositors heard was simpler: the banks will not touch them. Be precise about what that notice was, because the mechanics are the whole cruelty of it. In resigning the job, the Bank of Commerce was not accusing the Knickerbocker of anything. It was declining a risk. But a depositor cannot audit a trust company from the sidewalk. The only information available at street level was the behavior of the insiders, and the insiders had just stepped away from the door. In a system with no inspections and no published examinations, the resignation was the examination. That night, the Knickerbocker's directors met over dinner in a private room at Sherry's restaurant and asked Barney to resign, on the theory that his name was the problem. By morning, the resignation was in the papers directly beside the clearing notice. If the idea was to calm depositors, printing the two side by side did the opposite. Tuesday, October the 22nd. The bronze doors on Fifth Avenue opened as usual, and the line was already down the block. Messengers held places for men who had not slept. Women stood with passbooks. Guests wandered over from the hotel across the street to watch. Inside, the tellers counted out each withdrawal slowly, in small bills, the oldest trick a bank has for buying time. It bought almost none. $8 million went out through that marble lobby in under 3 hours. That is the 5% coming due. Shortly after noon, an officer stepped onto the floor and announced that the Knickerbocker Trust had suspended payments. The third largest trust company in New York was gone by lunch. 18,000 accounts froze where they stood, the rent money with the fortunes, and stayed frozen for months. Morgan had come back for this. He had been at a church convention in Richmond, Virginia, 70 years old, when the wires from New York turned urgent. Back on Madison Avenue, his library stopped being a library. It became the headquarters of the American financial system, with reporters camped on the pavement outside counting who went in. James Stillman of National City and George Baker of First National, the two other lions of the street, worked beside him. George Perkins, his partner, handled the press. Morgan himself spent the weekend receiving bankers while a doctor dosed his cold, a sick old man chewing an unlit cigar at the center of everything. The night before the run, he sent a young banker named Benjamin Strong into the Knickerbocker's books to answer a single question, solvent or not. Strong ran out of night before he ran out of ledgers. No answer meant no certificate, and no certificate meant no rescue money at 10 o'clock. Morgan let the Knickerbocker fall. It was not mercy, and it was not spite. It was triage, performed by a private citizen with no obligation to perform it, and no oversight while he did. And the trust that fell was good for its money in the end. The difference between living and dying that week was which set of ledgers could be read before the doors opened. Nobody involved ever pretended otherwise. If you want the rest of that catalogue, the mechanism and the men inside every panic with a name on it, subscribe to Boom and Bust. Wednesday morning, the panic chose its next name. The lines formed at the Trust Company of America, a few blocks south, on the thin logic that its directors overlapped with the wrong men. Strong went into its books overnight, the same way, and came out with the opposite answer: solvent. Good assets, terrible hour. Morgan is supposed to have said that this, then, was the place to stop the trouble. Whether or not the sentence came out that clean, the money behind it was real. The healthier trusts were herded into a common pool of money to lend the besieged one, with Morgan deciding who put in how much. The Secretary of the Treasury, George Cortelyou, came up from Washington and placed $25 million of government money in the national banks, and the Trust Company of America paid out 13 of its 60 million in deposits, slowly, in small bills, and was still standing at the close. A trust that answered the door did not die. That was the lesson the street was being taught, one lobby at a time. The trouble was no longer confined to Manhattan either. That same Wednesday, Westinghouse Electric was forced into receivership, unable to renew the short-term loans it lived on. The Pittsburgh Stock Exchange closed its doors rather than price the wreck. Out in the country, thousands of small banks kept their reserves on deposit in New York, a pyramid with its point on Wall Street. Now they wanted their money home, all at once. Banks across the country began paying out in scrip and certified checks instead of cash. Currency traded at a premium, real dollars for paper promises, and the clearinghouse dusted off its emergency loan certificates so that banks could settle with each other without a single coin moving. The United States, for a few weeks, was running low on money itself. Keep that picture in mind, because everything Morgan does next happens inside it. Thursday, October the 24th, the panic reached the stock exchange, and what Morgan did between 2 and 3 o'clock is the reason this episode carries his name. Brokers on the exchange financed their holdings with call loans, that is money borrowed against stock overnight and renewed every morning, and on an ordinary Thursday, it cost 3 or 4%. By early afternoon, there was no money in it at any price. The quoted rate touched 100%, annualized, which is not really a price at all. It is a market's way of saying, we would rather not. Ransom Thomas, the president of the exchange, crossed Broad Street to Morgan's office and told him the floor could not live to the close. Dozens of brokerage houses would fail by 3 o'clock, not because their stocks were worthless, but because nobody would renew yesterday's loan against them. Thomas wanted to close the exchange early. Morgan told him the exchange would close at its regular hour, and not 1 minute before. Then he sent for the bank presidents. It was around 2 o'clock. Inside a quarter of an hour, he had pledges of $23.5 million, and a messenger was reading the number aloud to the floor. Men cheered him, the way a burning block cheers a fire brigade. The exchange closed at 3, upright. Friday it nearly happened again, and a second, smaller pool held the floor together. Over the weekend, Morgan's people asked the clergy of New York to preach calm on Sunday. The sermons were duly preached. In the same fortnight, he underwrote $30 million of New York City bonds, because the city itself could no longer borrow enough to pay its teachers and its contractors. When the lender of last resort is a private citizen, even the pulpit and the school payroll become his business. Nobody had voted for any of this. It worked anyway, and both of those facts are the point. And then the strangest part. Life went on. The second week of the panic barely reads as a panic in the daily papers. It reads as inconvenience. Employers put certified checks in pay envelopes because there was no cash to fill them with. Some factories paid wages in scrip, company paper, spendable at the company store. Cotton waited on the docks in New Orleans because the banks that financed its shipping had stopped answering. $1 in actual coin bought a premium over $1 in any other form. People grumbled, adjusted, and queued. That is how these things feel from the inside. Remember it. A financial system does not fail with a bang. It fails like a tide going out, quietly, until the boats are sitting on mud. The last problem of the panic was the biggest one, and it is where the rescue stops being simple. A major brokerage, Moore and Schley, had borrowed some $25 million against a mountain of stock in the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company. Ore fields, coking coal, furnaces, most of it in Alabama. If Moore and Schley went down, that stock would hit a falling market all at once, and nobody wanted to learn what it would take with it. Morgan's solution had the elegance of a man who had spent 50 years buying things. United States Steel, the giant he had assembled 6 years earlier, would simply buy the Tennessee Company outright, paying not in scarce cash, but in its own gold bonds. The dangerous collateral becomes safe paper. The brokerage is saved. And United States Steel, in the middle of the worst money famine in American memory, acquires the best iron ore south of the Great Lakes. 2 obstacles stood in the way. The weakest trusts, with the Lincoln Trust bleeding worst, still needed one more pool of $25 million to hold their counters, and buying the Tennessee Company looked, on any ordinary reading, like a violation of the antitrust law that the sitting president had built his public life on. The first obstacle is why the library doors were locked. On the Saturday night, Morgan let the trust company presidents argue in one room among the tapestries and the tiered shelves. He sat in the librarian's study with a deck of cards, playing solitaire. At 4:45 in the morning, he walked in and laid the subscription paper in front of Edward King, the dean of the trust presidents. "Here is the place," he said, "and here is the pen." King signed. They all signed. The doors were unlocked, and the trust companies of New York had bought their own survival with their own money, on terms set by the man holding the key. The library night settled the panic. The breakfast just made it legal. 2 steelmen, Elbert Gary and Henry Frick, rode a special overnight train to Washington. By Monday morning, before the market opened, they were sitting with Theodore Roosevelt. They did not tell him what United States Steel was paying. They told him the purchase would, in their judgment, stop the panic. Roosevelt, over breakfast, said he felt it was no public duty of his to interpose any objection. Word reached the floor of the exchange around the opening bell. The market steadied, and the panic, as a street event, was over within days. The argument about what had just been bought was only beginning. Now the price tag. United States Steel paid about $45 million in bonds for the Tennessee Company. Within 4 years, a congressional committee was hearing witnesses value its ore and coal at several times. That, with the wilder estimates running toward $1 billion. You do not have to believe the billion. The Stanley Committee, in 1911, read the purchase as an acquisition dressed as a rescue. Brunner and Carr, who wrote the standard modern account of the panic, read it as a rescue that happened to be a bargain. A century on, those are still the two readings, and the record honestly supports both. Morgan did save the system. He also went shopping in its wreckage, with an antitrust waiver obtained over another man's breakfast while the system was still on fire. Both things are true, and the second one is the reason the first was never allowed to happen again. The street panic ended in early November. The bill arrived over the winter, and it was paid by people who had never heard of United Copper. Cash stayed hidden in mattresses and safe deposit boxes for months. Factories that could not borrow shut their gates. Industrial production fell by about a tenth. Unemployment more than doubled. A corner that failed on a Broad Street pavement put men out of work in every state that had a railroad through it. And on the 14th of November, Charles Barney, at home on Park Avenue, having asked Morgan for a meeting and not received one, shot himself. Morgan never explained the refusal. The Knickerbocker reopened the following spring and paid its depositors in full, with interest, exactly as its ledgers had promised all along. Barney did not wait to find out. The other names collected their endings too. The Lincoln Trust held. Charles Morse went to federal prison for misusing his banks, then talked his way out inside 2 years by convincing the doctors he was dying, a diagnosis he had manufactured with, among other things, a diet of soap. Augustus Heinze fought his indictments, largely beat them, and went back west, dead at 44. Otto's firm never reopened. The men who lit the match were, in the end, the least of it. Then the consequences began their work, and they run in a straight line from that November to the money in your pocket. Congress moved first, in 1908, with the Aldrich-Vreeland Act. It was an emergency currency law with a study commission attached, and the commission turned out to be the part that mattered. The emergency currency itself would be used exactly once, in the first weeks of the World War, and then never again. The commission changed the country. In November 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich took a handful of New York bankers aboard a private rail car to an island off the Georgia coast, officially to shoot ducks. They traveled under first names only, so the porters could not report who was aboard. The men on Jekyll Island spent the week drafting a plan for an American central bank. Congress fought over the plan, renamed it, moved its centers of power, and passed it 2 days before Christmas, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act. The Republic finally had a permanent answer to the question of that October. Morgan had already given the age its epitaph by then. The winter before, he was hauled in front of the Pujo Committee, the congressional hunt for what the papers called the Money Trust. Samuel Untermeyer, the committee's lawyer, asked him whether credit rested on money or on property. "No, sir," Morgan said. "The first thing is character." The gallery laughed at the old man. His family always believed those weeks on the stand shortened his life. He sailed for Europe when it ended and died in Rome 4 months later, at 75, before the institution built to replace him ever opened its doors. The exchange he had refused to let close flew its flags at half-mast. One more appointment closes the circle. When the Federal Reserve Bank of New York opened in 1914, the man chosen as its first governor was Benjamin Strong. The young examiner who had sat up all night with the Knickerbocker's ledgers, deciding who was solvent, now held the job Morgan had invented for himself over 3 weeks in October, made permanent, salaried, and answerable. The pattern did not retire with him. A century later, in 2008, the system wobbled again, and the decisive meetings were once more held around private tables in New York, bankers deciding over a weekend which firms would open on Monday. The table had moved from Morgan's library to the Federal Reserve's building on Liberty Street, a few blocks from where the Knickerbocker's depositors once stood in line. The furniture changed, the scene did not. So, the question this episode leaves you with: Was the library night a rescue or an acquisition? I have read both cases, and I am still not fully settled, and I would like to know where you land, so tell me in the comments. What the record says plainly is this: the system was rebuilt so that no one man would ever again hold that key in his coat pocket, and the power to decide who lives did not disappear. It moved into an institution, and Americans have been arguing about that institution ever since. Every crash was somebody's payday. In 1907, it was collected in steel bonds, and the receipt was countersigned at breakfast.